Okay, so our penultimate paper is Privacy Governance Not Included, Analysis of Third Parties in Learning Management Systems. I've learned more about LMSs today than I have in many years working in academic units. And Jan Shvartzschnaider is here from York to join us. Yeah, it's all you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Really great to be here, and I think it's a sign of a great event when you sit there with your eyes and mouth open and learning so much. So really happy to talk to you about our work today, and also a nice follow-up for a previous Kelly set it up for me pretty nicely. So this is a collaboration, and I'll talk about my work in more general terms and where this whole thing fits. It's part of a bigger project of educational privacy, EdTech privacy, that we're working with Illinois University and Colgate, as well as the University of Chicago and NYU. And at York, I'm running a privacy rhythm lab, which essentially I'm a computer scientist, so learning a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk to you about today was a learning curve for me. What we're trying to do is step away from traditional computer science privacy definitions and look at privacy through more societal values and norms and expectations, and see where the technology that we build today essentially generate information flows that deviates from those norms and expectations. We're using a particular privacy theory for that with contextual integrity, and I'm a big advocate of that theory. So if you're interested to learn more, you certainly can talk to me afterwards, and we're also organizing an event in Toronto later this year. So we'll talk about this. But yeah, that's the kind of work I'm doing, and if you're interested, I really would like to connect with you and talk more. All right, so like I said, I'm a computer scientist, software engineer. I like to build systems, and I feel there's a lot of good in them, and I think the pandemic showed some of that, and some of the good side of that as well. It helped us certainly go through some challenging time and enabling us to continue offer education, getting students, graduating them, and so forth. So a lot of the techniques and technologies that we built and used certainly had a very good impact. So I'm very happy for that, and certainly would like to continue using technology. But unfortunately, I guess there's there's the good, there's also the bad, and certainly the ugly. I'm going to show some of that today and discuss some aspects of it. So certainly this technology can be used for other purposes as well, and there are some concerns of students being surveilled, and a lot of the information that was collected and processed, and certainly not in the way that we used to. And now that during the pandemic, when they were connecting from their homes and we were actually lecturing from our living rooms, a lot of the things that we used to were quite different, and a lot of the norms and expectation were breached really by technology, sometimes on purpose and sometimes not so much. So quite a few cases that are of concern. So my work in general looks at those services and asks the question whether they not so much preserve but respect our privacy. So it's not about compliance, it's not about data minimization, it's not about secrecy, it's not about that we collect only this type of data, or we comply with this type of regulation, which is, or we have the informed consent of students because they just showed up and they signed in and everything is fine. What we look at as what are the norms, what are the expectations in particular context, which in this case it's education, and where we use the technology, what are the information flows that essentially deviate from those norms and not align with the values and purposes and functions of that particular context. So it's much broader, much richer understanding of privacy, which unfortunately is not as prominent in the regulatory context, but essentially pushing for that, and I feel like having that notion in mind will help us build better technologies. Right, that's the setup, that's kind of what I do, but I guess today's talk will be more on a particular subset of that, which is learning management systems. I have to say a lot of what I'm going to say applies also for all the systems that you use, if you're using Teams or using Slack, or all of those systems that you use during your work. That's actually still there. We'll talk about integrations and plugins, and a lot of them support those as well. And it's quite a murky area, which often we don't pay attention to. So I guess after Kelly's talk and also having having a professor, faculty, and students here, we all know what learning management systems are. And at York, we're using kind of instance of Moodle, which is called eClass. But there are a bunch of them out there. And certainly during the pandemic, there was a rapid move towards centralizing this. I still remember having a website put out on my personal page or my professional page, but like a website for my course, and now it's all centralized into learning management systems for sometimes good reasons, kind of make sure that it's all managed and certainly provide some benefits. But as we discovered through this work, a lot of it wasn't thought through as much, and there's quite a few gaps in governance and how information is actually managed, and often it is left out there for us to, to discover. So part of this work, we particularly looked at integrations. So if you ever used Moodle, and I'm sure it's the same for Canvas and Blackboard, that's actually an actual screenshot. You have this ability of obviously uploading your own content, but also adding external services. And I think that you can see the one here somewhere that says external tool, all right there. Once you click on that external tool, it gives you a list of tools that either was set in by the admin of the LMS, which is helps you, grade scope, crowd grade, all of the MATLAB grading or whatever other tools, Zoom in there. So you can embed and essentially connect your LMS to all of those external services. Now, that sounds fun, and it certainly helps a lot of it, to do our job. But how many of you? So first of all, how many of you used any of the tools? So we have here, I don't know, GradeScope or CrowdGrade or Zoom. Anyone? Any of those? How many? I see a few hands. So how many? Maybe some of you are. Anyway, but how many of you actually read their privacy policy? None. Okay. Right. You had? Okay. Okay. You probably were shocked. So if you use something like Turnitin, we're just talking about it. You'll be shocked how much information they collect that you don't know that they collect, how much information they collect about you, how much information they actually store from what you actually upload, and so forth. Now, if you go to Turnitin, that's kind of a side, but if you go to their privacy policy, they have this nice paragraph. They cite GDPR. They refer to GDPR saying, we actually the processor of the information, not the controller. What in kind of what that translates to is that we're not responsible to what information we're getting. That's your university. Your university decides what we get. If your university doesn't give us information, they're the controller. They're essentially not. That was kind of interesting positioning, saying whatever we're doing, it's all legal and it's all not. We are compliant with everything law out there, which is kind of an interesting statement. Anyway, so there's quite a few of those tools. What's interesting is that that's not the worst case. The worst case is when you can actually connect an external tool that can be any GitHub, some service out there that has no even privacy policy on its website, some random one. Now, obviously, as if you responsible instructor and you think about this stuff and you try to be careful, you won't do that. But if you find something shiny out there that just promotes itself as, I will help you grade 300 papers in like 3 minutes, just don't worry about it, just plug it in. The setup is very easy. It is, actually. So why not? So sometimes things can happen, and without even knowing, you're actually transmitting a lot of information to that third-party service without actually knowing what they're going to do with it. And yeah, so something we really would like to investigate and kind of highlight the issue. We're not the only one paying attention. There was this interesting case just in the beginning of last year from the IPC of Ontario, and essentially there was a case brought up by parents of this school in Hamilton, where they noticed that the school, first of all, the school was using Google Apps platform. So there's a Google Classroom, I guess, and there's a whole Google platform that supports this interaction. And through that, you can install apps, and you can definitely do integrations of other things. And what parents were noticing that their kids were actually getting ads related to their activity on that platform. So some of them actually complained. That complaint was investigated, and so it was saying the complainant believed that the Google and other third-party vendors are collecting more of students' personal information than it's necessary, contrary to the section of the Act and so forth. And what's interesting, and it's kind of leading towards what we were working on, is the IPC determined that the board doesn't have reasonable contractual oversight of measures in place to ensure privacy and security of personal information of students, which is not surprising. It's quite difficult to know what information flows are actually generated, what's collected. Sometimes it's not even mentioned. They probably sometimes vaguely mentioned in the privacy policy. Google is a whole, I'm not picking up on Google, but all of those platforms host quite a few apps and integration and plugins, so it's very difficult for definitely one person or just a group to figure it out. So you need an effective governance process to actually get some progress on that one. So that was interesting and kind of motivating case to see what is out there. Although our work here that I'm going to talk about focuses on universities, as I was mentioning, it's part of a larger project. We're looking at schools and high schools in the US and in Canada to see what are they using. So we certainly like to reach out and connect with local schools. So if you want to talk to me, please do. And it's still ongoing. A lot of the insights that I'm going to discuss here today are just initial ones, and we still need more data. And in fact, it was quite difficult to reach out to we tried to get to faculty and also people actually using those tools, and it was quite a challenge. But yeah, still ongoing, and still would like to connect as much as possible. So what are the research questions? Essentially, we would like to see how, those tools, in particular the plugins, and so LTI stands for Learning Tools Integration, so that's a de facto protocol for integrating a lot of the tools for our external websites. It's heavily used, and plugins is slightly different infrastructure, but with the same result. Basically, information is flowing outside your main LMS. So we would like to know what are the activities, where the governance activities around those LMS, and in particular, what is the state of governance around plugins and LTIs, what is taking place, and what are the issues that are still there that we need to be resolved. And again, because it kind of sets up for other projects, we'd like to build on that, and we have a big group, so hopefully we'll have something to say on that too. And what's interesting, we would like to, specifically in this case, there's other issues, but we're looking at privacy issues of those tools and how privacy is actually governed. And just kind of spoiler alert a bit here is that a lot of the institutions conflate security issues with privacy issues. So anytime you have a body, I explicitly see them as different issues. They certainly have overlaps, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. But certainly in our lands, those are different issues, and it was kind of, especially through our interviews and as well as survey, we were trying to explicitly decouple the two and understand what are the governance for the security part of those tools, which is very important, but as well as privacy as a separate one. All right. So the methods for this, first we essentially just a bit of a background. So we tried the questionnaire. So we built out what we thought was a good questionnaire, and we really tried to reach out to people in charge as well as people who are faculty, and just to feel them, to get info from them on what is happening and what they, at least from their perspective, is happening. It was challenging. We didn't get a lot of numbers, and appreciate any help on that, but we tried everything. We tried panel. We hired a company to do that, and it didn't work out. And then we sent out to our mailing list, and so unless there is just people are just tired of all the surveys, which I can understand, and or so forth, but we did get some response, but and it was it was quality because it was tied to networks we know. But we certainly would like to get more. So this is still something we would like to do. And again, if you have some ideas, it would be nice to hear about. Then the next step was to get more, to complete that, was to look at what we call as publicly available documents from the US and Canadian universities, but I just got back from a legal scholarship privacy conference, and they informed me that this may be not an exact term that we should have used, because publicly available is quite a broad. It doesn't. What we had is what we were able to find, what they put out online, the documents that are put out there, but it's not covering all the publicly available documents. In fact, they gave us quite a few interesting ways of actually getting all publicly available documents, especially for public universities, institutions, that we can analyze, and we plan to do so. That was a nice takeaway from that. So we did the analysis there, when basically seeing what are the governance processes in there, who is in charge, who are decision making, and so forth. So, and then lucky for us, one of the co-authors was able to reach out this interdisciplinary multi-institutional group of data governance officers that essentially dealing with this kind of type of questions, which is great to see that this is on their agenda, and they're essentially, understanding the issue, and we are essentially preaching to the choir, because they're the ones that pushing for a lot of the protections and a lot of the issues we were trying to uncover. So 25 universities, and I think we had 45 data governance officers from 14 universities that gave us a bit of an insight of how things are managed and so forth, which was really nice, because oftentimes it was quite difficult to understand what are the governance processes that are the university, any particular university has, without actually being faculty there or talking to someone there. So this was good for us, and certainly informed our research quite a bit. And again, my main goal, I guess, from this talk is actually getting feedback. So if any suggestion, feedback on any of the research questions, on the methods, that will be appreciated as well. And certainly talk to me afterwards if you would like to learn more on those. Right, so I'll give some highlights, and really would like to leave some time for you to, for us to talk about this stuff. So we analyzed 112 universities in general, just going and seeing what are they using. So the most popular ones, top 3 LMS systems were Blackboard, Canvas, and Moodle. That's for and lists, and then the ones that were listed. There's Google Apps for Education, not many. And then Brightspace also didn't pick up. And there is common plugins. I don't know if, Proctoria. We have another work on proctoring tools, which have special place in our investigation. Proctoring tools are quite notorious in collecting quite a bit of information about us. Turnitin, I mentioned that. Honorlog, Gradescope, Crowdmark, all those were quite popular, and again, if you're using any of them, I highly recommend reading their privacy policy. You might reconsider. But yeah, so the idea was just to understand what's being used. Other works, other projects that we are actually doing as part of this team is actually investigating what are the actual information flows they generate, what data they collect, and so forth. Here we just want to see what's out there and what's being done to essentially govern them. All right. So from the survey itself, we try to understand what are the processes involved in adopting new plugins. So I think the slides, there's some font issues. But basically, the idea is, how would you decide to adopt a new tool? And from what we got, and this is just a sample here, but the idea is that usually it's initiated by somebody in the faculty or somebody in the institution saying, okay, we would like to get that tool integrated into our LMS. Let's see if it's good. So if the university has a particular process in place, it goes through some kind of review, and that review, I'll talk about that in a few next slides, but there's different types of review. They can outsource that to a third-party company a vendor that will essentially review based on particular questionnaire, what are the practices are, and so forth, and if everything is good, it will be adopted. Not all universities have that process, so in some, that would be just faculty wants to integrate, they will go to an IT person and say, I want this tool. They say, okay, I need this tool now because you have my class, this has to happen and it will happen. And then that kind of goes without actually a thorough review. So that, again, nobody's trying to, everyone has a good intention here in terms of, sometimes the tool is well known, sometimes it's urgent and so forth. But again, it highlights that without proper governance, things can actually fall through the cracks, and that's not good. So the other issue is, which actually is true for all software, but plugins in particular, because they're dealing with educational information about students, faculty, and in fact the system. What happens when plugins are being updated, and sometimes when through a new update they will bring new capabilities. Again, if you have good governance policy in place, those have to be reviewed again, see what's actually happening, and so forth. So just a side note here, so LTI is a protocol, so you have the tool hosted somewhere else, and what LTI, Learning Tool Integration Protocol, does is essentially allows you to connect to that third-party service and basically upload student content. And so you essentially have, if it's Gradescope, for example, CrowdMark, you upload assignments. Let's say your TAs grade those assignments, and then once the grades are out, so basically the grades of your students and the assignments are hosted on the third-party server. So think of it what you will, but then let's say you trust it and they're all good. Then they will actually connect back to your, through LTI, they connect back to LMS and update the scores for your grading, your grades in the LMS itself, so you don't have to input them in. So it's very easy. I think that helps, when you have a big class, and it's quite convenient. But there's quite a few things going on here. First of all, you're uploading student data to that server, then you essentially have their identifiers there. Sometimes they will say, don't worry, everything is anonymized in their privacy policy, which is almost impossible to do. I don't know how they do it, but anyway, they would say, we're compliant with everything, don't worry, and then they will essentially process that data, and there are quite a few questions there, and which are not being asked in terms of, we kind of trust them to do, because it's in their best interest, I guess, because they want to be part of this context educational setting. But anyway, and plugins are more built in towards a particular service, so they can still connect to the mothership, I guess, to the first server, but they can actually be self-sufficient within the service and using the information from the LMS. So there's some technical differences here, but again, both of them can connect and generate external connections to external services and use web services and so forth. So again, very handy to look at this from an information flow point of view rather than the data type of particular sort, and that helped us through our lens with the time. Okay, again, from the questionnaire, from the survey that we had, we really wanted to know what is in place to actually do the auditing and examine. And we were pointing out, we actually didn't know about this by some, that there are a few vendors out there that they provide assessment toolkit with essentially just a questionnaire, and that you just check in, okay, do they say they sell data? No, check. Do they essentially, promise not to do anything else with the data? Yes, check, and so forth. So again, and there's this group is EDUCAUSE. It's actually quite big. It has a lot of membership, and they're doing, I feel a good service here. They essentially provide some kind of tools to look critically at those services from a privacy perspective, but they're primarily geared towards security and other, do you have a privacy officer? Check, things like that. So we need a more systematic and more robust way of looking at those. And again, we're happy to know that there's some schools that actually have a privacy audit, and they look at, again, they baked it in with security process, but essentially they look at whether the service is compliant, whether it's in the US, so that's FERPA. If it's in Canada, it's PIPEDA and FIPA. So that's good to see, and certainly, but again, this is good if you only think of privacy as a compliance or data-driven kind of thing. If you think of it as in terms of information flows breaching the norms and expectations of a particular context, this doesn't mean much. It just says it's in the right direction, but really a service can be compliant and still violate your privacy. So something that we would like to contribute here and say this process is a good thing that they exist, but they have to be more informed and cutting-edge kind of state-of-the-art privacy frameworks and not being stuck with informed consent models that are currently being used quite heavily. Right, so we did that, from our analysis of the publicly displayed information, I guess, that would be my new term, of what the university put out there in terms of what are their process, let's see what UFT has. I think it's quite good and quite a few things. There are a few ticks here. Yeah, it's the best. Well, I just tweaked the slide a bit. I knew it was like a friendly crowd. But yeah, there are some schools. It's not that they don't have them. It's, again, this is not their official position. Some of it will behind the scenes. So it will be, we have that process. If you have faculty, click here, and that was not accessible to us. But it just gives you a range of things that is available out there. So there's a specific LTI policy in some. There's just general integration policy. There are policies just remaining for the LMS itself, which is not as coherent in terms of, and there are some universities that essentially, they don't encourage you, but they will essentially, I think it was Waterloo, they were saying on the website that as an instructor, you should essentially inform your students that you are actually using a service that collects their information and that this service is new. And but I think the interesting part was if informed consent is like you being informed, and by being in the course, you're consenting. So it's kind of an interesting model. But again, it's good that university have this process in place. As I'll talk in the next slide, they are not coherent, and there's no one good kind of governance process, usually fragmented governance, and this is something we essentially think needs to be more, needs to be addressed. All right, I think UFT is doing good, so we can move on. Okay, so I guess the bar is very low, so it's not like nobody's doing any. I mean, this is new to us, and I think being part of. So what happened was during the pandemic, we all moved into to those online services, and our other work looked at using video conferencing, and it was essentially emergency, right? And I think the question we always ask, what happens when the emergency ends? First, there's two questions. When the emergency ends, nobody knows, and then essentially when it ends, what happens? So what I guess sometimes happens, if not always, that a lot of the technologies actually remain. And a lot of the practices that we said that were for emergency, well, we need to use Zoom and we need to use LMS because this is something that will help us through this. But then everything becomes, let's just keep that. And I think we have to go back and see what are their practices, what are we have in place to ensure that maybe now that we have maybe slightly more time to reflect on a lot of the services and policies, how can we address those issues moving forward? Right, so the interview analysis actually, I recommend going into the paper, and certainly we can talk afterwards, gave us quite a few insights. Some of them, some of the officers asked to be anonymous for basically, but were quite frank with us about the fragmented governance and who is in charge and how it works. So it was fascinating to know. Again, we were not trying to point out a particular. We just weren't trying to understand there is a problem, how big it is, and what needs to be addressed. And we were very grateful for the insight. So from the interviews, we realized there's quite different universities will have different bodies responsible for this kind of process, for this government. So obviously IT, but you have also Senate and the faculty governance bodies, and there's departments and colleges and so forth. And there's some institutions that actually have a privacy and security officer, which is great. And then sometimes it actually comes down to individual instructors that actually they decide what is good and what it's not, which, again, maybe a good instructor, but still it's quite difficult to know often because you don't have the full picture. But certainly they emphasized the overall general lack of understanding of all of those issues. And again, this is not to blame anyone. It's really complex. There's quite a few things that are being collected, used for different purposes. And we just heard in previous talk by Kelly that sometimes this information is used for reasons, for purposes that we never thought about and actually completely oblivious to. So lots of that in terms of that it's quite difficult and they don't know what's going on. Again, through emergency situations, you kind of can understand this, but I think this is a good moment to reflect and maybe address that. Right, so some interesting kind of takeaways and tidbits from the interviews. So the vendors are leading, so they sell things to us, and they basically convince faculty that something is good and rush, but sometimes there's not a lot of scrutiny. And I think, again, I'm not saying that's every time and so forth, but it's certainly kind of a nice summary of some of the issues that can happen, that you basically have so much fragmented governance, so you can introduce a tool that you don't actually fully know what they're doing. Kind of helps you, helps maybe your department, but literally you don't know what their policy is, what information is going towards them, and what is actually being collected. But there's some good news, kind of, in that a lot of the universities that we've spoken to, that other governance officers saying that we are pushing back through different means, and again, we can discuss those. Universities have some negotiation power through the tool. So when you use Zoom in U of T or York, you have an option to use their consumer kind of facing privacy policy, or you can actually negotiate a particular data practices for your institution, and you can actually push back. In fact, they know this, so they will actually have a special addendum that they offer to universities to ensure that there's some kind of formal negotiation. They kind of help, services can help us as institutions. Through that process, I would recommend having kind of somebody on our side from the institutions to review those, but still there are tools to kind of push back for a lot of the practices and say, no, we don't want our students' information flowing towards your servers, and you're not good with the things you are planning to do with it, or do a particular thing. This is the service we want for a particular reason. This is who actually needs to get that information. Again, treat it as an information flow and keeping what is called contextual integrity in place. So this is good to see, and again, hopefully through moving forward, we'll see a lot of pushback and kind of more coherent governance throughout the institution. And in fact, what we notice is that having this forum of government officers talking to each other actually help, because they actually learn from each other and actually share useful ways of dealing with those and tactics or just governance, putting governance in place. So that's really nice to see, and I think as we'll get to our recommendation, having that in place is actually a good thing. So we'll have some time to talk. So takeaways from this, again, this is just a start, and this is part of a bigger EdTech privacy project that is being, we're doing across US and Canada, and certainly would like to see how it's in Europe, maybe later. So this transition to LMS system, certainly, again, during the emergency, we kind of understand why, but it introduces to a new privacy threats that we haven't seen before, and basically introducing some tooling that we don't have the governance in place to review and deal with, and because we have this fragmented and dysfunctional governance in some places, this actually makes it worse. So we have outdated regulations, and that's just from privacy perspective point of view in general, and now certainly when you inform the review process from that, then saying, oh, we pipette compliant, we good. Well, no, and then we should be much more rigorous about this, and often we don't know who's in charge, who actually makes the decision, and maybe that's the algorithm somewhere, but but often this is important to know, and so forth. So the lack of expertise in this particular privacy domain definitely hinders the process, because outsourcing a lot of the things to third parties introduce quite a few challenges, and the only way to deal with it right now is have a questionnaire where they answer the questions, hopefully honestly, that they are compliant with all of those things. Don't worry, your students' data is safe with us. I mean, that's maybe a good step start, but we should be more demanding. Some recommendation, and I think that kind of resonated through other talks as well, is that we need feedback and we need to provide, we don't talk to students about this, so we need to have students in place, and somebody suggesting having a strong student governance presence at the institutions is certainly a good thing. It's not just students, faculty don't know about those things as well, so having faculty informed and having their input about the tools they use and how they use and all levels, and having this kind of put together and discussed certainly provides a good opportunity for improvement. Implement consistent oversight, coordination amongst decision makers, and also share the insights across universities. We in this together, honestly. A lot of those tools are used across, and having the lessons or some of the suggestions and helpful tips will help to make sure that those things are tested and reviewed properly. And certainly enhancing data governance professional development, which is again, I don't know how much universities put emphasis on, but understanding the issues, understanding that governance matters, and not just, I'm looking at privacy issues, but I think generally, and I think this is something that we certainly should be looking at right now, especially after introducing so many tools without thinking too much, and just by, through 2 clicks and it's there, suddenly all the data is leaked towards them. So it's something we should be mindful. All right, so with this, I'll thank you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions, suggestions, and feedback. Thank you so much.
So it seems that the fundamental challenge here is that you have professors who want to use technology for some reason, right? And we understand why, but there's a whole plethora of ones that get used there. Mm-hmm. And then basically data, like technology management people at the university and lawyers who can't keep up with what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. And then students who we don't talk about, right? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to think that student councils are the best avenue to deal with this, because I was on student council and it's just strange people who do that. And don't have an appreciation for all the different ways things are going. So does anyone hold out certification for this stuff where they say, we have a certifying group of students and faculty who get together and talk about whether this particular technology, helps students, has some minimal degree of privacy, and we put a stamp on it and say this is good enough for students, and then that's the seal under which they sell it?
I mean, I think there are plenty of organizations that will offer you that seal for particular, just join, sign, and we'll give you the seal. Right. I think the problem is twofold, right? I think there are not a lot of forums like that. That would be great to get everyone around the table and just talk about those things. But just before that, I think there's quite how do you say it? We don't have a good definition of what privacy is. For a lot of people, maybe, so there's a legal conception of privacy, and and I think having this broader view of privacy tied to actual value. So it's not about just, what information flows where. It's, again, understanding why it's going there and what are the purpose of that information and what's going to happen. So having that first and inform people about that will be a good step forward. And then once you have a coherent understanding of what privacy is and what we're actually trying to address, having that kind of forum where everyone comes together and says, yeah, I use that tool, and this is something that happened. Maybe generated, it helped me, but it's actually exported all my classroom data to their services is a good thing. First of all, it's not, but yeah, we can. Once we get the definition right, like in terms of consistent definition, which is not an easy thing, because again, I'm a computer scientist. So for me, for a long time, it was about let's encrypt stuff and just send it over, and it's fine. We'll deal with that later. It's as long as it's compliant. But I've been through my conversation with information scientists and philosophers on this. We forget that technologies are embedded in a particular context, And in this case, and for this work, we looked at others, but this one is such educational context. And I mentioned this in my comment previously, that we forget that there are values and purposes of this context. It's not, it's not a business, or maybe, now it's run as a business, but it has a particular way, some values that we embedded through generations, why students come to universities, what they're trying to do here. And we're kind of betraying that trust a bit, right, by introducing those tools that now this information is essentially flowing to outside this context for purposes that, first of all, they don't know about, we don't know about, and definitely as a society don't expect to happen. So, yeah, it's not easy. I think there shouldn't be one expert saying, I'll say this is way to go. Yeah. There should be a conversation, and I think everyone is welcome around that table. I think.
So if I could just follow on, I mean,
yeah.
I think what you've said is there's a really important part of it, and it was reflected as well in what Kelly was saying, in that like a university council,
right,
and or procurement,
right,
don't know what students want,
right,
or how students view privacy,
right,
or
right,
in terms of the multiple trade-offs that get
right,
made in using one piece of software over another,
right.
They don't appreciate how students feel about it or how professors feel about it. Right. So I mean, I'm just trying to understand the scale of how much product there is out there, because there is a model where you sort of say, look, like universities put together a consortium, and if you're going to sell in learning management systems,
right,
they're going to go in front of like a deliberative body of like 12 students and 12 faculty members, and they're all going to try something and talk about what that technology does and where to send its data, and you can tell us how it's going to help or hurt students. And then they, on behalf of other students, say, yeah, on balance, this is a good one, right? Or this one's strong on this, weak on that, right? But you get sort of a community-based standard for that particular piece of software. I don't know how much scale there is, like if we're talking about hundreds of pieces, or if we're talking about dozens of
What was that slide I have? Like, there are quite a few. So
There's
if you're
quite a
talking
few.
about LMS,
It's not thousands,
it's not LMS is just a platform, but you have integrations, right? So that's in the hundreds. That can get anything
into the hundreds.
Yeah. So again, depends what you're looking for, and I'm all for integrations helping with the I mean, they're not bad. They can actually do useful things. So it's not that them on themselves by themselves they're actually a bad thing. It's all about appropriate flow of information, and I think having that kind of conversation and I actually am in favor of actually kind of coming back to it, right? So you use it for a while, you have this initial kind of agreement that this is the thing that kind of our university needs, maybe a faculty require. We go in, we investigate, we see what their practices are, what are their policies. We actually do some analysis on actual information flow that actually they generate and that they maybe somehow omitted in their privacy policy. So anyway, you do some data of analysis and you agree, okay, this is it, but you should come back to it, right? And through iteration and see, and build better practices, right? So if you allow for this to happen, it's basically, as I was saying, essentially, you end up the tyranny of the normal. Basically, it becomes normal that those we collect because everyone else collects that, and we use it for other purposes because, well, we can, and so forth. So there's a role to play both on us as a community members. There's also a policy angle here, certainly regulation, but we need to inform it, right? And getting kind of consistent way of understanding what the issue is. Right now it's quite fragmented, and they can tell you from different angles saying, well, we don't collect personal information. So we don't collect personal information or we obfuscate. That's just very limited understanding what privacy is. So first of all, if you anonymize data, it can be easily de-anonymized, quite easily from basic information. Then you collect every single activity of every single on your LMS. That's plenty of characterize and profile and so forth. So and there's no such thing as personal data. In my view, it's basically, it depends on the context, depends on the flow. So I'm pushing, I'm advocating for, it's not easy because again, this is quite prevalent in legislation, and even in today's world, when you look at it, you actually have categories. So there's like sensitive data. What is that? So they will have particular categories they don't collect. So if they don't collect sensitive data, everything else is free, why not? And then, so having those kind of labeling is not very helpful. We need to investigate how those systems perform within a particular context, and what are the information flowing within particular context, understand that better, rather than focusing on particular types, because that will certainly won't give the protections that we want. Yeah, there's a question.
Sir, and then Paul. Yeah. Way back.
So one question is, I wonder what you think about cookies online, like when you go onto a site and it says accept cookies or like change the settings so that
Sure.
you don't. Is it worth changing the settings to not give them the cookies, or is it kind of irrelevant information?
Okay, so from a technical point of view, cookies have a particular function to play. So they will. So for example, if you're buying on Amazon, they'll collect your state, right? So you don't have to sign in every time you go to the next page. That was their initial. So that's kind of the basic functionality. What happened was that they started to be using, to collect, track you across websites and used by advertising companies. So I'm not a fan of that. So from a technical point of view, they have functionality that is useful, and this comes back to appropriate flow of information, which is the definition of privacy that I follow, which is contextual integrity. And so there are some inappropriate information flows that cookies generate. So I would definitely, when I see those GDPR enforced kind of cookie, I refuse all but functional. Up to you what you decide, but yeah, there are some needed functionality that they offer, but they've been used far beyond what they were put there in the first place.
Okay, much appreciated.
Yeah, no worries.
I was also wondering about what kind of information does Zoom proctoring and I had one more. What kind of information is being collected? Is it transcripts? Is it like the actual video, or
all the above? So basically, if you look at Zoom, I'll give you an example of something that. So when we started using Zoom, you have this typical notion of privacy. Well, do they collect? I don't know, your audio, right, or things like that. But what we didn't realize at the time, I guess, it was that suddenly Zoom becomes our classroom or becomes our, lecture room, and the fact that they were actually transmitting a lot of the information about you in general, the information about your room, right, to your peers. I'm not saying they collect that, or it's basically, that's an appropriate flow of information. When I teach my class, I don't show them my living room. I don't know where my students' homes are and what they look like. So that's led to them introducing the background, which was but that's just to tell you as an example that some information flows are not typical in terms of, as a computer science, you see the packets and where are they going and where the data types the general kind of much broader sense of what it is. Now, when you look at proctoring tools, that's interesting, because if you look at their privacy policy, again, they say it's up to the institution, but if they have the capability of collecting audio, video, pictures, who is in the room, movement, clicks, your interaction around, it's basically, they're trying to proctor you, right? And there are quite a few cases there that were, shown that they collect too much, and sometimes they actually do a very bad job at what they were supposed to do in the first place. But in terms of data collection, they do quite a bit and quite extensive. We have a different work on that, and happy to talk to you about it. But the list is long, and they're not very clear. I mean, they say that it's not their responsibility to decide. It's up to the admin person at the university to let them. Okay, can we record the video, movement, sounds, all of that, and if the institution says yes, because they want a good job of proctoring, they might say yes, and then that will be collected and processed and used for whatever. So in terms of their practice, yeah, they collect quite a bit. The more, the better for them.
So they could create like a profile of who you
Oh,
are.
that's for sure. I don't know if they do, but yeah, for sure. I mean, you mean they can create a profile of a cheater? So like you just come in and say, oh, you don't even should take the exam because it's
For anything like
yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
yeah.
it's scary. I mean, based on that, yeah. But I'm more more curious about the inappropriate information flows do we actually need to collect that data in the first place? Yeah.
Yeah, is it possible to make these programs without collecting this information? Like use the info at the time and then delete the information?
But it's also,
afterwards?
do we need them in the first place? So certainly, again, as a computer scientist, I like having technology being used for what seems like a good reason, right? You say we have a pandemic, we would like to have what is assessment integrity. And this is more related to the other work. But it actually quickly, we have educational context has this, you have to enrich this experience, and you have to, have some trust in your students, and they're here for, certainly there will be somebody who will take advantage of that, but would you build a whole ecosystem around that, or would you actually, change your ways and maybe provide different assessment that doesn't require you to police your students as if that's, one other thing is that we noticed while working on that project is that so during the pandemic, they're all proctoring tools, they're proctoring systems, but now they transition into maybe what Kelly was is like analytics and so forth. So they're like, we know now, we know a lot of things, so we can actually advise. And so they're not an analytic tool, they're not a proctoring tool anymore. So they changed their name to Mizzou or something, and they would just completely move into analytics, offering a proctoring service if you want to. But so it's quite easy for them to transition based on the climate. So it's an interesting area. Again, needs to be very closely monitored, I think, before universities or any other institution, public institution or anywhere jumps and installs them.
And just one other thing that's been on my mind. So in terms of sharing information online, like let's say you're trying to educate other people, as soon as you do that, I'm worried that now algorithms can basically take your ideas. So if you've done a lot of research and made connections between the research, that's sort of the human capacity that maybe the algorithm hasn't quite achieved yet. And so how does it balance out trying to educate other people and also trying not to have it steal your ideas, essentially?
I don't know if what I argue for is that systems should respect, privacy norms in particular contexts, and we building tools and ideas to help that. So if they adopt them, that's a good thing. I think that basically, unless what you're saying is that, let's say we build a system and it kind of understands the governance part, the policy, the norms and expectations, and if can find a way around them. That's possible, maybe. I haven't thought about it that much. What I'm trying to, in the work I'm doing, is trying to push this notion of privacy as contextual integrity, which is not becoming to, it's starting to catch on a bit. So I would be happy if those systems were at least talk to me in the same language, rather than just trying to kind of circumvent it through oh, we don't collect this type of information. Talk to me about, the information flows. Talk about, the values that you're trying to, you're building the system for, and so forth. And they probably have ways around it, but I'm not worrying about that too much. It's just more, getting out there and getting maybe us, like as institution, more aware of what is possible beyond the traditional privacy kind of notions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, happy to talk about it afterwards. There's a question there.
Thank you.
Yep.
That was very interesting. Although I have to use Canvas like everybody else who teaches here, I'm fascinated by the data governance model that you've identified. I'd be worried about the small universities that can't afford,
Correct.
like they can afford
Right.
to buy Canvas,
Correct.
but they can't afford to have data protection. Am I correct in assuming that most universities, because all of this is in the cloud, and that you've got your part of the cloud, am I correct in assuming that LMS data that would be associated with an individual is firewalled off from personal data that the university would collect, like where your parents live and whether you paid your credit card and all this? Is there some like what is the norm in a university for walling off what's in the LMS, your picture,
Yeah.
whatever picture you decided to put in,
Yeah.
from other things the university knows about you as a faculty member or student?
Right.
'Cause it seems to me that's the privacy issue that is easy to explain to parents and students.
Right.
That what you tell us about your family income in order to qualify for aid, what we know about your child's access to university mental health is not available to the vendors of Canvas, to the makers of Canvas.
Right.
Is that a fair assumption?
Okay, so first, I really like, they say there is no cloud, there's just someone else's computer. So that's a way to look at it.
Well, and it saves a lot of universities a lot of money to have the cloud.
So I think during the pandemic in particular, so I know that there were some instances when big universities will actually have resources to host this on their own servers. Right. I'm not saying that's the best model. I mean, it's certainly gives you more control, but we're conflating here the privacy issues with security issues. So if you upload to cloud, maybe you have resources, but it can be fairly secure in that. Certainly, so I'm not saying cloud is uploading it to a cloud, that's what will create privacy issues. Certainly, from a security point of view, there's a debate whether the university is equipped enough storing this kind of information on their servers and more vulnerable to hackers and so forth, rather than a well-known, cloud provider that has all this in place and have the best security engineers working on this. But I think something I forgot to mention, and this is in the paper as well, we mentioned external plugins. There's internal ones that are developing internally, and they deal with a lot of the information that you might say, well, if your message is, don't worry, all the personal information is not going to the cloud, it's all with us, and that's why you should be relaxed. I would push against that because a lot of the information that the university collects might not be also used appropriately. And think of every time you're using university computer, all of this information can be collected and analyzed, and then towards the end of something that Kelly was mentioning, maybe some kind of review of your performance will be, discussed. And I don't know if that's appropriate or not. We have to discuss that as well. So I'm not looking at where the information is. Again, I'm looking at what type of information shared with whom for what purpose. So if it's within the university and it's your kids' information shared with, with some analytics department in the university, I'm not sure if I'm going to, it's a question for me whether it's appropriate or not. Although it's within the university, it's in the university body. So this information flow needs to be analyzed. So I'm again pushing back from particular so there's 5 parameters that I'm looking at. Who is sending the information to whom? What type of information? About whom and for what purpose? And in order to understand the privacy implications, you need to understand values for all of them. And if you just choose one and say your student information are just stored at the university. You just identified 3 parameters, and I need to know the purpose. I need to know what is it there for. So again, cloud itself, as a technology, has a purpose. It certainly can virtualize resources, make it easier, and can be, in fact, I would trust. Although Google is, you're using Gmail, and you feel like Google is scanning your emails and so forth as for AdWords. So that's a privacy issue. But from a security point of view, Google has a lot of resources to protect their servers. So your email is much more secure than you running in your basement or next to you, because your server will be hacked easily, or at least it's much more. So from a security point of view, having this cloud infrastructure can actually make sense. And again, if you take the privacy issue more broadly, then maybe even from that point of view, I find it quite easy. Again, I'm not... not that I'm new, but I was introduced to this way of thinking about privacy. As a computer scientist, I wasn't taught that way. I was saying, okay, encrypted data, access control, role-based access control, all of those models that essentially labeling and so forth. But it actually made it easier for me to think about it and talk to different kind of stakeholders by having a more information science, philosophical theory of privacy. So if I talk to a parent, I say, this information goes to this actor for this purpose. Are you okay with it? Is it acceptable? And it's much easier to have that conversation. And then I can build, part of other work I'm doing is building tools that will essentially align themselves with what is considered appropriate and so forth. So. Yeah, I don't know if I answer your question, but yeah.
Yes, I will just observe that I can see that Turnitin might be something that a university would certify, and there are many, many, many universities that use it, and there is sort of a fairly transparent data model that universities must be comfortable with. But the idea that a professor would say, I need this plugin. And that any university would say, oh, yes, professor, we'll put it in tomorrow. I appreciate that universities don't have locked down PCs and notebooks the way corporations do.
Yeah.
But the idea that you as a professor would be allowed into the university's cloud with something that you'd installed on your computer, and the university's firewall wouldn't say, excuse me, we're not letting you be in the cloud and use this piece. You know, Canvas does not belong to the faculty member. It belongs to the university. And anything in a university cloud at some point belongs to the university, and there are certain things you don't, you're not allowed to store there. So the whole idea that small universities, you'd call up the IT officer or your IT officer, and you'd say, I want to install this on my lockdown computer in my office, and I'd like it tomorrow morning, please.
Right.
You know, do organizations operate that way in the 21st century? Really?
Well, you should. I wouldn't single out small universities. I think it's all of them have those gaps in governance where you have ability to just use tools that are not properly vetted from a privacy perspective point of view, in particular privacy perspective point of view. So again, you were saying that Turnitin can be compliant with everything and even the university policy. But is it enough? And they basically collect all of the data that the students' assignments, all of this data, and now they're actually using to train their models. Is that appropriate? I would certainly, and it's allowed. So I think it's the point is it's not just a small university. It's quite complex. It's became more complex because more tooling are geared towards this. They were not designed for educational context, so they have to kind of find their way through that. And I think it's a good moment for us to kind of think more carefully about this. Yeah.
Let's say thanks very much to Jan for a great
cheers.
presentation. Fantastic. Yeah.